Oh shit, I forgot my shades. Oh well. Hello, Jacksonites, and welcome to another new series that I'm starting on my channel. This, like any other series that I start, um, will be sort of a sporadic series that will only have a few episodes at first, but then I'll add more at a later date. But I am at least a bit more prepared for this one than I am for Super Ultra Binge or like Super Cyborg Binge, for example. But today, so this series was inspired by a couple people. So a while back, Cody Leach did a video um doing a video called, I think it was my favorite film from every year of my life. And that was a fun one, and it got me inspired to potentially do the same thing. Hello, Texas Guy Movie Reviews. And I thought, that's a good idea. So let me try my hand at that. I quickly found that I couldn't name just one favorite movie from every year of my life. So I decided, how about I do like a top 5 favorite movies from every year of my life? And I was like, I don't really think that's good enough either. So slowly, this idea morphed into this series that I'm starting today. Um, Welcome to the first episode of what I'm calling Super Cinema Rank. Now, I hope that sounds nice and like rolls off the tongue nicely. Almost sounds like I want to say super cinnamon roll, but whatever. Yeah, super cinema rank. Almost did it there. Where I will be going through every single year for the last 90 years of cinema and ranking every movie that I've seen from every decade and year. I say every decade and year because the first 4 episodes of this series, I will be ranking every single movie I've seen from every decade. Episode 1 today will be me ranking every movie that I've seen from the 1930s and the 1940s in one video, not in one list, because admittedly, I kind of already have done that. So, and the reason why I'm doing the 30s and 40s in one video is because the last, oh, of the last 90 years of cinema. And the reason why I say 90 years is because I am not doing a video for silent films. Only because I've seen Nosferatu, I've seen Young Sherlock Holmes, and I've seen The Hunchback of Notre Dame. That's it. Those are the only 3 silent films I've ever seen. Oh, and actually no, 4. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And I don't really like any of those movies. Silent films are where I draw my line when it comes to cinema. I'm not a fan of silent movies. I think they're interesting, like they're interesting to discuss, but they're not particularly fun for me to watch. Um, so I'm not touching anything from the 1920s. I know that there are important films in the 1920s that influenced cinema to this day, but that's just not my bag. And so the reason I'm only going back to the 1930s too is because that's where most of my area of expertise is, from the 30s all the way up until now. But the reason I'm doing the 30s and 40s in one video is because of all the decades of cinema. These are the 2 decades that I'm the least familiar with. For the 1930s, I've only seen 13 movies, and I've only seen 19 movies from the 1940s. I could have possibly done the 40s as its own video, but since both of these lists are so short, literally it's only 13 movies over an entire decade for the 1930s. That's just kind of boring. Like, what are you going to do? Rank the one movie that you saw from 1939? Yeah, I didn't think so. Also, a brief disclaimer. So, this episode may not be very long because for the 1930s and 40s, most of these actually, no. Yeah, most of these movies I've already talked about. Whether it be like Son of Kong, for example, for the 1930s, I've already talked about many times in my various kaiju videos. And for the 1940s, all but two of these films are Universal monster movies. So I might be repeating myself for a fair bit for this video. So I beg your pardon if I do, but I had to start somewhere. I didn't want to do the 1950s and then onward because people will then be asking, well, why don't you do the 30s and 40s? So yeah, this might not be a very long video, but you got to start somewhere. So bear with me. If I do repeat myself quite a bit, I do apologize. And again, unfortunately, this has to be said because people just don't know how to separate opinions. Yeah, this is my opinion. These are the movies that I've seen from every decade and year, and these are how I rank them from worst to best. Oh, and one more thing too. So the first four episodes are going to be episode one is the 1930s and 40s. Two will be the 1950s. Three will be the 1960s. And then four will be the 1970s. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to split the 1980s up into either at least two or three videos. The first half of the 80s I'll probably make into one video, and I don't know, like 86 to 89, I might split up into two videos. I'm not sure. I haven't fully completed ranking the 80s. And starting from 1990 onwards, it's going to be one episode per year. So that'll be 33 videos ranking every movie from every year of my life at that point. So this will be a long series, but that's why I'm starting out with this batch of 4 episodes so that I can at least have a start. It'll give me some time to finish ranking all the movies I've seen because there's a lot. There's 210 movies from the 1990s alone. So hopefully this will be a fun journey. There's a lot of movies I have talked about already, but there's some that I never really have discussed. Even for the 1930s and 40s, there's one in each list here that I've never talked about on my channel. So hopefully this will be a lot of fun. I don't just stick to horror, monster, and sci-fi movies. I do like other stuff in other genres, but that's just the main things that I stick to. But thankfully, like I said, in each of these lists, there's one weird outlier that I have ranked pretty high in both lists. So hopefully this will be a fun journey. So, before we begin, a word from our sponsor. And hopefully you don't hear any, or at least much, background noise. It's actually me and my son here by ourselves. So I'm just keeping an eye and ear out for him. He's in the other room watching Madagascar 3. The fuck? Alrighty. Before we begin, a word from our sponsor. That's yummy. Alrighty. Starting off, of course, with the 1930s. I go all the way back to the year 1931. 1931 to 2023 by the end of, well, no, maybe 2024 by the end of this series. Who knows? Alrighty. In the 1930s, Starting off with number 13, the worst film that I've seen from the 30s is 1935's Werewolf of London. I didn't like this movie really at all. I don't like the design of the werewolf. I don't like the story. Um, the story itself, it's boring, slow, and does not make a whole lot of sense most of the time. It just feels like a weird, random series of events that vaguely resembles a werewolf movie. And I know that this, well, I mean, there are some silent films apparent supposedly that were about werewolves, but um this was the first like existing werewolf movie, so they didn't know what the hell they were doing, but god, this movie was just such a bore. And the werewolf action in and of itself was very underwhelming and very randomly inserted into the movie. Uh, None of the characters are likable. All of them are so one or two dimensional and flat and boring. The music's bland, the cinematography is bland, and the ending, in true universal horror monster movie fashion, is abrupt, anticlimactic, and lame. Did not like this movie whatsoever. Right below that, we have Dracula's Daughter. Not a worthy sequel to the original Dracula, even though I don't really care for that film. I like that the movie picks up right where the last one left off. You see a lot of that happen in a lot of modern day horror movies and like Halloween 2, like on my shirt here. Honestly, of all movies that do that, Halloween 2 is the biggest example that I immediately think of sequels that pick up right where the last one left off. And the consistency between the two films is fairly strong. There is a nice sense of continuity. It's just a shame that the second part of the Dracula story is the shittier of the two. The only thing that Dracula's Daughter has going for it is Gloria Holden, I think that's her name, as Countess Zaleska, and her servant, who with his monotone, bland, boring, hilarious performance. But outside of that, Dracula's Daughter is also a chore. Extremely anticlimactic ending, very unthreatening villain, um, an extremely annoying gag of mispronouncing Van Helsing's name as Von Helsing. Like, what the fuck? Um, and it doesn't really, I mean, it does feel like a Dracula sequel, but at the same time, it doesn't. I mean, it kind of was actually. But even back in 1936, it feels like people were taking unrelated scripts and just crowbarring them into being a sequel to something else. That's what this movie kind of feels like. Um, yeah, Dracula's Daughter just sucks. And I also should give a disclaimer. I'm not overly positive about these first two decades. A little bit more so for the 40s because of the universal horror cycle. The 40s is the one that I'm a bit more familiar with because, well, A, there's a lot more movies in the 40s, but there is also just more movies of the universal horror cycle that I like. So, but I'm not going to sugarcoat my thoughts on the 30s and 40s. Coming in at number 11 is the original Dracula. I'm just not a fan. The only thing this movie has going for it is Bela Lugosi as Dracula. It's just a shame that the movie around Bela Lugosi is a complete snooze fest. The lack of music is incredibly distracting. Um, all of the characters outside of Dracula are boring and unlikable. The ending and third act feels very rushed and abridged and anticlimactic. Um, It's just not a great movie in my opinion, aside from Bela Lugosi. Of course, Bela Lugosi is great, but the problem too is that he's not on screen a whole lot. When he is, the movie is more enjoyable, but it is still just a complete snoozer. Not a fan. And right below that, at number 10, is the Spanish version of Dracula. The Spanish version of Dracula has all the same problems that the English version has. It's a total snooze fest. The lack of music is very distracting. There is a little bit more violence, which, well, I'll save that for just a little bit later. All the characters are flat and boring. There's a lack of Dracula. When he is on screen, he is entertaining, especially with him looking a lot like Nicolas Cage. Funny that Renfield came out this same year and is being a sequel to this movie. Um, so he's of course the highlight, and there is just a little bit more violence, and there is a longer runtime, and that's the ultimate reason why the Spanish Dracula is superior to the first film. It is more ambitious. There's many added scenes that you don't see in the English cut. There's a lot more ambitious cinematography and camera work that makes this movie not feel like a stage show like the English version does. It feels more like a complete proper film, but the problem is it's kind of the same issue that the TV cut of King Kong 76 has. It's just a longer version of the same movie. It has all the same problems. But Spanish Dracula, I think, is worth a watch, mostly for its historical significance, and it's one of the first examples of an alternate cut of a film being vastly superior to its original cut. But overall, I'm just not a fan of this movie. Coming in at number 9 is Son of Kong. I've talked about this movie to death. So, I mean, what can I say about this movie that hasn't been said already? This is one of the most disappointing monster sequels ever made. Disappointing sequels in general, because really the ultimate problem that this film has is that it's fucking rushed. Had they not released this movie in the same year as the original film, it would have been far better. But the dumb studio executives at RKO thought that the public was too stupid not to remember this gargantuan, monumental movie that had been released only 10 months prior. Oh, nope, they're not going to remember it. So we got to hurry it out and hurry and get it out before they forget about it. Idiots. The special effects are rushed. The story is very abridged. It as soon as it feels like it's getting good, the movie just throws in a extremely rushed, anticlimactic bullshit end of the movie disaster just to get everything done and over with nice and quickly. It's dumb, stupid, bullshit, and disappointing. Ah, God, this movie just gets weaker and weaker and weaker the more I talk about it. Hold on a second. Okay, good. Making sure Roman's movie isn't over. Coming in at number 8 is the original Frankenstein. Um, in hindsight, comparing this to Dracula and actually every movie before this is a way better movie. But the reason why this is so low is that I do think this is a very overrated movie. And I can't really call it a great film because, well, I just don't really think it's a great film. Sure, it might be, well, it wasn't the first, but it's the most famous adaptation of Frankenstein, but it's obviously not the best. And it also is only part one of a two-part story, this being Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, which, if you watch both movies as one continuous film, um, it does work as a decent adaptation of the original Frankenstein novel, but another reason why I prefer Bride over the original Frankenstein, most of the stuff that I like in the book happens in Bride of Frankenstein. Also, similar to Dracula, um, This film suffers from a lack of music, and outside Colin Clive as Frankenstein and Boris Karloff as the monster, the rest of the cast is boring and flat. Oh, and there's Professor Waltman too. Um, so he's fun to watch at least. But and also, not to downplay Boris Karloff as the Frankenstein monster, but I definitely don't think this is his best performance. Um, Even though I wish that he spoke in Son of Frankenstein, Boris at least does a lot of talking with his body and his facial expressions. So you can still tell what the monster is thinking, but here the the performance of the monster feels very stiff and prototypey. Groundbreaking for its time, sure, but compared to Bride and Son, this does feel like the weakest of the three. So this isn't a bad film by any means. I just think it's very overrated and prototypey. Right below Frankenstein at number 7 is the original The Invisible Man. The reason why this is in the middle of the list is because I think it's equally half good and half disappointing. The good parts are, of course, what's his name? What is his name? Damn, I wish Victoria was here. Claude Rains. The biggest highlight, of course, is Claude Rains as the Invisible Man himself. He has a great voice, a great personality, and a just a very stunning, um, charismatic, entertaining performance as the Invisible Man, of course. Um, and the effects too, especially for 1933, are a major showstopper and a major game changer, and they're very impressive, especially for the time. But I feel that the movie is at its best during its first half. It's when the Invisible Man goes on a rampage that honestly the movie goes downhill. In true Universal fashion, the film ends very abruptly and anticlimactically. Oh, there's Victoria. Hi, bestie. Um, Again, The Invisible Man is not a bad movie. And as a start to the Invisible Man franchise, it's a good start, but I just like a couple of the sequels a little bit more than this one, honestly. But it is a decent start. Coming in at number 6. Oh, there's two movies in the 30s that I've never talked about. This is the first of which is the original Snow White. The Disney Snow White film, the very first animated Disney movie ever made. Now, I am quite familiar with the history of Disney animated movies from the 30s up until about the early 2000s. And now I haven't watched this movie since late 2019 or early 2020. But I have seen this movie many times because growing up, this actually was one of my favorite Disney movies. Um, in hindsight, it definitely is very prototypey, and it was an odd choice, at least in my opinion, to start with Snow White. And in recent years, the Snow White story has become kind of unfortunately creepy in a way, considering Snow White's supposed to be 14 and the prince is like in his early 20s at least, trying to save her, but whatever. Just looking at the movie in and of itself, it of course is a classic. It's not my favorite Disney animated film, but it's a very great start to what once was a great legacy of animated movies for Disney. The animation's great. It's very well, not crisp and clean, but even though for its time it still is very, very impressive. A lot of future Disney caricatures and archetypes and design motifs are cemented here. Like if you watch Snow White and then you watch like Dumbo or Pinocchio or Cinderella, you can see a lot of traits and motifs going all the way back to Snow White. And even if you watch Disney movies from the 90's, you can still see some things that, if you go back to Snow White, they look very familiar. Um, and, is a good early outlier for the typical Disney princess shtick. Again, not the best, but is a very good start. It's also quite funny. It's very heartwarming. The music is phenomenal, of course. Hi ho. um, and of course, my favorite of the dwarves is either Grumpy or Dopey, because Grumpy is an ass and Dopey is a dumb ass. Yeah, Snow White is a classic. Again, not my favorite Disney animated movie, but is a very good start. Top five territory for the 1930s. At number five, we have Bride of Frankenstein. This is a great movie, and it's a great sequel. And like Dracula's Daughter, it does pick up very well right where the last movie left off. And the consistency is pitch perfect. Same director, the same cast, relatively. At least all the major heavy hitters are back. Great new additional characters. It sticks much closer to the novel. It does end abruptly and unfortunately, but still, this is a very solid sequel and a very well made film. And of course, it commits the biggest um, both sin and major plus to a film by giving the monster the ability to speak, which is something they really should have retained for Son of Frankenstein. But still, Bride of Frankenstein is a great movie and a great sequel. Can't say enough good things about it. And of course, Ernest Thesiger as Dr. Pretorius, great slimy skis ball. This is the other movie from the 1930s that I've never ever talked about. Is the 1939 Wizard of Oz at number four. Now, I loved this movie as a kid. I hated it for a long time, mostly because of my dad, because he's a massive hater. But The Wizard of Oz truly was a overlooked gem when it initially came out. Because fun fact, for those of you who don't know, the 39 Wizard of Oz was actually a box office bomb, but it was through television showings and home video showings that this movie was reappraised and people realized, oh wait, this is actually is a great movie. And it is a great movie. It's one of the most colorful films, especially for the 1930s, I've ever seen. I don't really know much about the books, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, that this is based on. But from what I can tell, it does look like, even though it makes a lot of changes, it still does look like the Wizard of Oz. And even though it's not a Disney movie, you could be mistaken, or you could be forgiven for mistaking it as such. And you could also be forgiven for thinking it takes place in the 50s and not the 30s. That's what I thought for the longest time, too. I thought it was a 50s film, but no, it's a 1939 movie. Um, Not one of my favorite films of all time, nor is it one of my favorite fantasy films necessarily. Um, I think I would like Return of Oz a lot more if I was to ever see it, but The Wizard of Oz truly is a great movie. It's one of the it's a legacy fantasy film for other legacy fantasy films, in my opinion. So good on that. Coming in at number three, this really is only at number three just by default because hmm, maybe I should have put this at number five. Hmm. Well, still, at number three is the original King Kong. I mainly have this at number three just for historical value. I am a kaiju fan, of course, duh. And had it not been for this movie, we wouldn't have the kaiju genre, or at least we would have a very different kaiju genre had it not been for this movie. And many movies that we love today, including many more that we'll see in the 1940s and every decade from so on in this series, owes something to the original King Kong. Peter Jackson's a King Kong fan. Frank Darabont's a King Kong fan. Gareth Edwards is a King Kong fan. The entire Godzilla genre owes something to King Kong. Team Godzilla still, but you can't deny that the original King Kong is a monumental film in cinema history, especially for its time. But with that being said, I'm still just not a big fan of this movie. Of the kaiju genre, there are literally dozens of kaiju films that I like way, way, way more than this film. I think it is the Citizen Kane of kaiju films. It's important, but something doesn't necessarily have to be good in order to be important, at least in my opinion. Coming in at number 2 is the 1932 Mummy. Of all the monsters that Boris Karloff has played, the Mummy is hands down Boris Karloff's best performance. It had a shitty ending, and that really is the biggest issue with this movie. The last 5 to 10 minutes are so fucking anticlimactic and rushed. This movie really could have used an additional 10 to 15 minutes, because man, does this just feel so just rushed. But damn it, that first hour of The Mummy is just stellar. There is a bit more music than Dracula and Frankenstein, but the extended periods of silence actually do work in giving this film a creepy atmosphere. And Boris Karloff is intimidating and creepy and spellbinding as Imhotep. The little bits of music we have are great. The cast is decent for what it is, but the true highlight is hands down Boris Karloff as the Mummy. You just can't take your eyes off him throughout the entire film. And at number 1, my favorite movie of the 1930s is Son of Frankenstein. The only issue that I have with this movie is that Boris Karloff does not talk as the monster. That was a huge missed opportunity for the directors and writers for this movie. But man, aside from that, Son of Frankenstein is a great movie. Yeah, especially for the 1930s. A 1 hour and 40-minute runtime, so it actually feels like a proper film. Very lavish and intricate score, a great cast of characters, great story, great plot, fun monster action, great performances. Son of Frankenstein, especially for the 1930s, is a very special film. And in my opinion, is both my favorite and the best film that I've seen from the 1930s. That's good. Now, now, moving on to the 1940s. Again, we have 19 films to rank here. And if Victoria is still here, I know a lot of movies on this list are going to be quite low that she's going to be ripping her hair out. Well, um, well, no, there's one movie that she loves that I know that she doesn't, or that she loves and she knows that I don't. That is fairly high. I only have it really high up here because similar to the 1930s, I just don't really have a lot of feelings towards a lot of 1940s films, even though the 40s I'm way more familiar with than the 30s. But still, there's another one that she loves that's also quite low. But hands down, the weakest of the 1940s at number 19 is She Wolf of London. What the hell was the point of this movie? Seriously. And how fucking boring this was one of the biggest wastes of an hour of my life I've ever seen. Despite the title, this is not even a werewolf movie. It's a murder mystery whodunit story that would feel more appropriate if it was an episode of a 1940s Sherlock Holmes TV series, if TV existed back then. The characters are all flat and dull. The story is pointless. That's really the biggest issue that I have with She-Wolf of London. It's pointless. It just feels like an hour of a whole lot of nothing with a twist ending that comes straight out of a whodunit Sherlock Holmes story. It's just completely pointless, and I feel ripped off of wasting an hour of my life. And I also don't feel bad that I fell asleep for 10 minutes of this movie. It was just so fucking dull. At number 18 is the 1943 Phantom of the Opera. I only I almost made this a uh tie between She-Wolf and Phantom. But the only reason I have this over She-Wolf is the color photography for the film is quite pleasing, especially for the 1940s. And it also should be acknowledged that, yeah, this film is fairly unique because it's the only classic Universal horror film that was in color. It's a shame that other Universal monster movies couldn't have been in color because if they looked as pretty as this, I want more of that, please. Okay, hold on a second. I think his movie actually might be over. Yep, it is. Okay, hold on, guys. Okay, good. Sorry, guys. Had to start up Shark Tale for Roman now. Okay, so yeah, Phantom of the Opera, it's just not for me. It's not a story that I'm interested in. I don't like opera. I hate even just listening to opera. It just makes my skin crawl and it fries out my nerves. I fucking hate opera. So no thank you. This movie's just not for me. Coming in at number 17 is The Mummy's Tomb. I've talked about this one many, many times. It begins with a 11-minute recap of stock footage from the first two Mummy films. And the remaining 50 minutes of the movie is just filling out the body count and just a whole lot of filler. Boring, bland characters. Not the best debut for Lon Chaney Jr. as Karis. It's just a whole lot of nothing. This is the most fillery mummy film of the whole series. You could say uh, if you count the Boris Karloff mummy as part of the 5 classic Universal monster or mummy films of the 50s, you could say this has middle chapter syndrome. Boy, does it sure do. And if it does, it's got to be one of the worst cases of middle chapter syndrome I've ever seen. This movie is another kind of like She-Wolf of London. It's the epitome of pointless. It's just a cash-in cheap sequel. Coming in at number 16 is The Invisible Woman. This isn't necessarily a bad movie, but to me, it's just the most unremarkable film of the whole series. It's just here mostly just as a gimmick type movie. Like we've had three Invisible Man movie. No, yeah, two Invisible Man movies before this. This just kind of felt like somebody was just like, okay, let's have an Invisible Woman, but then let's not tie it to the series and let's just make it a comedy. Again, not a bad concept necessarily, and this isn't a bad movie. It's just kind of pointless. It's also not a horror movie in the slightest. I don't really. I wish the 30 pack had not included this and She Wolf of London. um, not much to say about The Invisible Woman. Not a bad film, just very pointless. And right below that is The Invisible Man's Revenge. I wasn't a fan of this one either, mainly just because all except one of the characters are so unlikable. Um, that's the biggest thing that kills this movie for me. All the characters just suck. The highlight of the movie is John Carradine as a lowly scientist. That is literally it. And at this point, watching all the Invisible Man movies, I was really starting to get tired of the invisibility used for comedic effect shtick, because these are supposed to be more serious horror or at least suspense films, but with all these comedic elements, it just feels like an inconsistent, whiplashy tone, and it just wasn't sitting well with me. And at this point, yeah, I was getting pretty fatigued of the Invisible Man shtick. Right below that, oh, never mind, that's from the 50s. Never mind. I thought I messed up my list for a second. Right below that is The Mummy's Curse. A lot of the same problems as The Mummy's Tomb. It begins with 8 minutes of stock footage that just pads out the runtime. Karras gets an underwhelming, stupid, stale ending to his life, being just done in by falling stones, which is fucking stupid. But mainly it's all the scenes of Karras skulking around in the swamp, chasing Princess Ananka for 25 minutes, and her rising out of the swamp. That at least this movie looks refreshing, and there's a couple neat shots that we've never seen before. So it that helps this movie stick out more so compared to The Mummy's Tomb. But had it not been for all that, this would have been as bad as The Mummy's Tomb, maybe if not a little bit worse. Um, but yeah, Mummy's Curse, not great. Coming in at number 13, hey Victoria, is House of Dracula. W- mm, yeah, I'd say it's the. Do I like this or Frankenstein? No, one of the weakest installments of the Frankenstein series. It does do a better job of um juggling all three of its monsters. Originally, I had this movie like above The Invisible Woman, but in hindsight, no, this movie is a little bit better than I initially thought it was. It does a better job of juggling all three of its monsters. It even though it's like a weird half reboot, half sequel, when it is trying to be a sequel, it does stick to continuity just a little bit better than House of Frankenstein. Um it is nice to see a happy ending for. No, Vic, it is not. Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy is fucking hilarious, especially compared to this movie. No, I'm sorry. Meet the Mummy is way better than House of Dracula. And it does give Larry Talbot a nice happy ending after what, four movies in a row of Larry Talbot tragically being killed at the end of his movies. This does feel like a refreshing change of pace. But it's killed by the fact that the last 5 minutes of this movie is intercut with stock footage from Ghost of Frankenstein. Come on, guys, really? And the plot too is just kind of a hodgepodge of different ideas and storylines, just going all over the place. And the movie is just kind of a mess, in my opinion. And Dr. Edelman, sure, he's fun to watch, but his character is just all over the place. So, House of Dracula has some merit, sure, but it's one of the weaker films in the series, of the Frankenstein series, definitely. And for being an installment of the Frankenstein series, the monster himself doesn't have a whole lot of screen time and doesn't have very much to do. Glenn Strange, I mean, it's a bit better than what he did in House of Frankenstein, but eh. Right below House of Dracula is Son of Dracula. Funny enough. Um, no, that's Robert De Niro, Vic. Damn it, I missed. Um, Son of Dracula has some decent atmosphere. And it shows off more abilities for vampires, like turning into a bat, turning into mist, being intangible to bullets. And Lon Chaney Jr. gives a decent performance as Alucard slash Dracula in this. And it does have somewhat of a fitting downer ending as opposed to a lot of other Universal monster movies for its time. Um, and it has a unique setting. It's on a plantation ground. So it has some nice scenery to look at, but Son of Dracula was just kind of meh. Not a bad film by any means. It's well made and a bit more ambitious, and it's respectable that it's so different compared to other Universal monster movies. But in the end, it's just kind of meh. Right below Son of Dracula is Invisible Agent. Even though this is clearly just a 1940s wartime propaganda movie, it is an entertaining one. The guy who plays the Invisible Agent is fun to watch. He's very charismatic and entertaining as the Invisible Man. Um, there's some decent action, there's some fun performances, and even though Peter Lorre is obviously not Japanese, when he is interacting with Sir Cedric Hardwicke as a Nazi German dude, they have some funny, entertaining banter. Again, even though Peter Lorre is clearly not Japanese, I think it's just kind of funny. Yeah, Visible Agent, it's not bad, just kind of meh. Top 10 territory. Speaking of which, number 10 is Ghost of Frankenstein. A decent follow-up to Son of Frankenstein. It's not quite as good, but it does feel a bit, well, no, not as consistent as others, because why the hell is the monster gaining strength from lightning when it's stated in Son of Frankenstein that the monster was in a coma due to being struck by lightning? The fuck? Um, what can I say about this? Bela Lugosi once again returns as Igor, and he's good as Igor, but he's not quite as creepy or grizzled as he was in Son. But he does still give a very good performance. And when he dubs over Lon Chaney Jr. as the monster, it is very kind of in a uncanny valley way freaky scene when you see the monster clearly being played by Lon Chaney Jr. and you have Bill Lugosi's voice coming out of that body. It's very odd and jarring in a creepy way, which I like. But outside of that, I think Lon Chaney Jr. is just very bland as the monster. He just stands there like a just like a rock, to quote James Rolfe, unfortunately. Um, but fun cast of characters, a decent story. This one introduces the idea of brain swapping, which by the end of the Frankenstein series would get kind of tiresome. But in this movie, it is introduced as a really cool concept. And when it's not used as stock footage for House of Dracula, the scene with the monster stumbling around in the fiery room is an entertaining climax. Um, yeah, Ghost of Frankenstein, not a amazing film by any means, but it is entertaining enough. Coming in at number 9 is The Mummy's Ghost. I think released the same year as Ghost of Frankenstein, and another ghost movie. Um, Better than The Mummy's Tomb. I'm not gonna say much about this one. I've talked about the Mummy movies a lot. Not much to say about The Mummy's Ghost. It feels a bit like The Wolfman. John Carradine is fun as the new priest. This is Lon Chaney Jr.'s best performance as Karras. And there's some decent scenes of peril with Karras stalking around and killing people. Um, and it has a memorable ending where the girl actually does die by the end, similar to Son of Dracula. So, yeah, not much to say, but is entertaining enough. No, House of Dracula is not the better movie. Yes, Mummy's Ghost is better than Son of Dracula, Vic. That's why they're opinions. um, at number 8 is The Invisible Man Returns, the debut, especially in the horror genre, of good old Vincent Price. Um, what else can be said? Not the best performance as Vincent or from Vincent Price in any of his movies, but Vincent Price never gives a bad performance. Come on now. Even if he's just kind of phoning it in, Vincent Price is always fun to watch. He has a lovely voice, a great personality, and he plays the Invisible Man quite well in this movie. And while you don't get a whole lot of typical Vincent Price mannerisms and facial expressions, oh yeah, and he has a great laugh. This is his first starring role, and he is pretty serious throughout this movie. So there's not a whole lot of room for Vincent Price to do what Vincent Price does. This ain't no hilarious House of Frightenstein, that's for sure. But still, and it's the special effects, especially for the time, are very impressive. Hell, this movie won an Academy Award. So, um, starting off with the bang, Universal's cycle of for the horror films of the 40s definitely had a very good start with this movie. So, kudos. Invisible Man Returns is a great movie. Coming in at number 7 is Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. I talked about this a little bit with my Freddy versus Jason video. This is not my favorite versus film, but funny enough, there's another way that this movie is analogous to Freddy versus Jason. Similar to that movie, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman is honestly more of a Wolfman film than a Frankenstein film. The Frankenstein stuff is used just as a glorified plot device. And the Frankenstein monster himself is also kind of just a glorified plot device. Their end fight is entertaining for like 10 seconds because it's saved for the last 3 fucking minutes of the movie, but it does cement the dynamic of having a crossover versus film. One's got to be stronger, one's got to be faster, one's got to be the underdog, and one's got to be the more obvious winner. And of course, the ending always has to be somewhat ambiguous as to not risk angering either fan base. As a Wolfman sequel, though, it's great. We see a shot of the full moon. We see a werewolf transformation. We get classic Lon Chaney as the Wolfman going around killing people. Great music. Um, and I can see the significance of seeing the Wolfman and the Frankenstein monster on screen together at the same time as being very special for its time. Although having Bela Lugosi as the monster, I think was a very unfortunate miscasting. So no, Victoria, it is not number 1 of all these movies. Sorry to say. Oh, but this should make her happy. Coming in at number 6 is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. I still say that this movie is highly, extremely overrated. It's not Abbott and Costello's funniest movie. I'm sorry to say. It's not the best, but it is a fun movie. I just think it's incredibly overrated. I do also think there's too many monsters. The humor of Abbott and Costello and the seriousness of the monsters just clashes and mixes like water and oil. They just don't mix. I'm sorry, Vic. It's just not working for me. But it is still a fun flick. And it was a nice start to Abbott and Costello's tenure of meeting Universal monster movies. Or Universal monsters, I should say. Yep, I know. I'm just Varen. Coming in at number 5, this is the one movie that I've never talked about before. The Maltese Falcon. I've never seen any other Humphrey Bogart. God, that's a weird name, Humphrey. Somebody wanted to be nasty, they'd say Humping Bogart. I haven't seen any other Humphrey Bogart films, but I believe The Maltese Falcon might be his most famous film. I can see why. I'm not a big fan of film noir, but this is one of the best examples of film noir. All the characters are morally questionable. The story is about morally questionable guys trying to screw over other morally questionable guys. And yeah, this movie is the epitome of that. Peter Lorre has a great performance and a great character. Humphrey Bogart is, of course, Humphrey Bogart. Um, the pacing is quick, the dialogue is quick. Um, there's lots of tension and suspense. Maltese Falcon's a great movie. I saw this only once in my movie making class in high school, but it has stuck with me ever since. God, it is really hot in here. Can you tell I'm sweaty? Coming in at number 4 is The Mummy's Hand. Damn good mummy film. I think I actually might like this movie just a little bit more than the Boris Karloff Mummy. Only because it is a bit more entertaining. Although it is annoying watching The Mummy and then The Mummy's Hand, wishing so desperately The Mummy had a sequel, so it's just kind of like tonal whiplash. But still, The Mummy's Hand in and of itself is a great film. It is also a little annoying when they use stock footage from the Boris Karloff Mummy. Just makes you wish even more so that this was a sequel to the original Mummy. But still, it's a fun prototype Indiana Jones. Of all, I actually think this might be a better comedic mummy movie than Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. Almost. Definitely better than Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man. Victoria is having a fit down in the comments here. Um, is it Lampini or Silvani? I think it's Silvani. Silvani is a funny guy, and the two bumbling butt fucks that are like a poor man's Abbott and Costello are a lot of fun to watch. This movie is just fun. True classic Universal fashion. It ends anticlimactically and abruptly, but still, it's a good mix of action, suspense, and humor. Prototype Indiana Jones and prototype Brendan Fraser mummy film. So this movie is a high ranker for myself for that. Hopefully this one at least makes Victoria happy because she thinks my opinions are unbelievable. At number 3 is the original Wolfman. Not one of my favorite werewolf films, but this is one that I have a lot of nostalgia for, similarly to Brendan Fraser's mummy film. And aside from The Creature from the Black Lagoon, of all Universal monster movies, this is, of the classic ones at least, this is the one I have the most nostalgia for. The first 2 acts are all great. Lon Chaney Jr. does a great job as Larry Talbot, even though he's a total creeper on Evelyn Anchors. Their chemistry is still believable. Lots of great atmosphere, lots of fog and spooky lighting and shadows. Uh, Good brief performance by Bela Lugosi. Great werewolf makeup, lots of classic werewolf cliches that we'll see later down the line. Just has a very anticlimactic ending. Oh, and a great performance by Claude Rains as the Wolfman's father. The Wolfman is a good classic movie. And number two is House of Frankenstein. This one doesn't juggle all three monsters as well as House of Dracula, but outside of that, House of Frankenstein is a very fun film. It's a very ambitious script. Boris Karloff is an excellent villain in this movie. He's just such a evil, slimy skeezball in this movie. He fucks over everybody who makes the mistake of trying to help him out just to further his own damn self. Um, excuse me. And honestly, J. Carroll Naish as Daniel is a way better Hunchback of Notre Dame than any other Hunchback of Notre Dame, except for maybe the Disney version, but that's a debate in and of itself. Great werewolf transformations on Lon Chaney Jr. Glenn Strange sucks as the monster. He's literally alive for only, I think, 3 minutes in this movie. He just wakes up, kills Boris Karloff, gets chased by villagers, and then sinks in quicksand. Fuck you. And well, it is a bit of a culture shock to see Bela Lugosi and then go to John Carradine as Dracula in this movie. John Carradine does do a decent job as Dracula. He has the look and performance. I think it's really just his voice and his subservientness to a mere human that kind of makes him a bit pathetic. But still a good job playing Dracula. Overall, this is a fun flick and is arguably my favorite Universal monster movie of the 40s. Actually, obviously, duh, yeah, it is. And my number one favorite film of the 1940s is not a Universal monster movie, but it is a monster movie. My number one is the original Mighty Joe Young from 1949. Oddly enough, it's the last movie of the 40s that I've seen that just so happens to be my favorite. Go check out me and Jackie Boy's video. Glenn Strange is not the best, Vic, but go check out me and Jackie Boy's video. It's one of my best episodes of Super Kaiju Binge. Mighty Joe 49 is a very underrated creature feature. It may not be the most special movie ever made, but especially for its time, and yes, I do think still it is 10 times better than the original King Kong and definitely Son of Kong. It's incredibly underrated. I know that it has its fans, but still, and I do prefer the 90s remake, but still, Mighty Joe 49 is a very special movie, a very overlooked and underrated monster movie. So, well, this was fun, especially with Victoria having a shit fit down in the comments. Post your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and share this video with your friends. I might do the 1950s next week. I'm not entirely sure yet, but we'll see. And go out and watch some of your favorite films. And I actually want to challenge people to do this kind of thing. I challenge Lord Hellhound at the Horror and Metal channel. I challenge Jackie Boy. I challenge Shawnee Boy. And I challenge little Miss Victoria down here to do this very same thing. Do it at your own time because this took me a while too. But I still challenge all of you guys to go through every single year for the last 90 years and rank every movie that you've seen from worst to best. I am issuing that challenge right now. So thank you all for watching, and I will see all you guys in the next movie or video, excuse me.